There is a particular kind of man who survives long enough to understand what truly saves a life. Not strength, not luck, not the fertile land a father leaves behind. Old Chet knew this better than most. He was 73 years old, sitting in a rocking chair on a porch in Missouri, and his grandson had just asked him about the winter. Not any winter, that winter. Chet was quiet for a long time. He looked out past the yard, past the tree line, past everything his eyes could actually see into a distance that only old men can reach. Then he said, there were 5,000 of us, big men, railroad men, men who'd blasted through mountains with their bare hands and dynamite, and we almost starved to death in our tents like wet dogs. He paused. The person who saved us was an 18-year-old girl, and that town had been calling her crazy for the better part of a year. His grandson waited. Let me tell you how it started, Chet said. Let me tell you about the day she walked away from everything she was owed and walked toward the only thing that mattered. He closed his eyes, and the story began. 8 months before the storm, on a gray Tuesday morning in the early autumn, the Tanner family gathered in the front room of the farmhouse their father had built with his own hands. Prentice Tanner had been dead for 11 days. The lawyer had ridden in from the county seat, and he read the will without ceremony, the way men read documents when they are being paid by the hour. The farm went to court, the cattle went to court, the grain stores, the equipment shed, the Mule team, the Smokehouse, the water rights along the eastern fence, all of it went to court with the understanding that his younger brother Eldon would work the land alongside him as an equal partner. For Odell Prentice, Tanner had left 3 things. A mule named Tess, old and slow, with a tendency to bite strangers. A set of tools worn smooth at the handles from decades of use. And a small envelope sealed with candle wax with her name written on the front in her father's cramped handwriting. Court did not look at her when the lawyer finished reading. He looked at the window, then at Eldon, then at the floor. There was something in his posture, not guilt exactly, but the particular stiffness of a man who has decided in advance that he is right and is waiting for the conversation to catch up to that conclusion. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, almost gentle, which made it worse than if he had shouted. The farm is man's work, Odell. Father knew that. It's not a punishment. It's just how things are. Eldon nodded, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. He had always been the one who agreed by saying nothing, which was its own kind of cruelty. Odell did not respond. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the sealed envelope. She had known this was coming. She had known it the way you know a winter is coming, not because anyone tells you, but because you can feel the light changing. The lawyer packed his satchel and left. Eldon went outside to look at the cattle. Court moved into the kitchen, already talking about the spring planting, already inhabiting his inheritance, as though it were a coat he had owned for years and was finally allowed to wear. Odell stayed in the front room alone. She broke the wax seal carefully, the way her father had taught her to open things with patience without tearing. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unsteady. Letters of a man whose hands had been stronger than his health in those final months. She read it slowly, then read it again. Odell, if you are reading this, then I did not have enough time to say what I should have said a long time ago. The farm will go to your brothers. That is the law, and I was never brave enough to fight it. But I am leaving you something more important than land. I am leaving you what I should have built 15 years ago, before that winter, before your mother. I was too proud and too foolish, and we paid a price I will carry to my grave. The sketch on the back of this page, I drew it from memory, from what I should have done. Your hands are better than mine ever were. You know why this matters. You are the only one who still remembers. Odell turned the paper over. On the back, drawn in pencil with the careful lines of a man who had thought about this for years, was a blueprint. Not a house, not a barn, a chamber carved into stone with 2 narrow shafts rising toward the surface, a deep interior room labeled in her father's hand cold cellar, and a fire pit at the center with a clay flue snaking toward the back wall. Beside it, one small note: the mountain keeps what the seasons cannot touch. She sat with it for a very long time. Then she heard Court's boots on the kitchen floor, heavy and certain, moving toward the front room. He had heard the rustle of paper. He appeared in the doorway and looked at the envelope, then at her face, reading both with the practiced attention of an older sibling who had spent a lifetime monitoring what the younger ones were thinking. "What's in it?" he said. "A letter," Odell said. "Let me see it." She looked up at him. This was the moment. She understood it even as it was happening, the way you sometimes understand the exact significance of a door closing behind you. "No," she said. Court's jaw tightened. "That envelope came from our father. Anything he left belongs to this family." Odell stood up. She folded the letter and the sketch together once, twice, and placed them in the pocket of her dress, pressing her hand flat against the fabric. "Your father left me a mule and a set of worn-out tools," she said. "I think we have finished settling accounts." She walked past him to the door. She picked up the tool bags she had already packed that morning before the reading because she had known. She went to the barn and put the halter on Tess, who tried to bite her and missed. She shouldered the bag. Grit was waiting at the barn door. A black dog with amber eyes watching her the way he always watched her, with a steady, unblinking attention that felt less like loyalty and more like common sense. He had never been Court's dog. He had never been anyone's dog but hers. He fell into step beside her without any instruction required, and they walked away from the farmhouse together, and Odell did not look back. Not because she was not sad. She was. The grief of it moved through her chest like cold water, but she had somewhere to be. Graymore was a small town, the kind that knows everyone's business and considers that a virtue. It sat in a valley between two ridges, green and prosperous in the warmer months, and it had the particular self-satisfaction of a place that had never been truly tested. The people there were not cruel by nature. They were simply certain, which is sometimes more dangerous. The road out of town ran north toward the mountains, and if you followed it past the last fence post and kept walking until the ground began to rise, you reached the base of Ironback Ridge. It was a vertical wall of dark granite shot through with veins of pale sandstone rising 200 feet above the valley floor. No one farmed it. No one wanted it. It offered nothing that the people of Graymore valued: no soil, no water access they could see, no shelter, no practical use of any kind. It was exactly what Odell was looking for. She found the place she wanted in the early afternoon. The granite face had a shallow overhang at about the height of a man's shoulder, and below it the rock changed color, shifting from the dark gray of the outer face to a warmer, sandier tone that ran in a band perhaps 4 feet thick before the hard granite resumed. Her father's sketch had noted this. Sandstone was softer. Sandstone could be worked. She tied Tess to a juniper and set down her bag and took out her father's pickaxe, which was old but well-balanced, the kind of tool made in an era when things were made to last. She looked at the rock face for a long moment, the way her father had taught her to look at any problem, not to attack it, but to understand it first. Then she swung. The impact rang off the ridge and down into the valley, and Grit sat down at the edge of the overhang and watched the path below with his ears forward, a dog at his post. She did not know that someone had watched her pass. Veda Marsh lived in a small house at the edge of town, close enough to the road that she could see the traffic without being part of it. She was 35 years old, a widow, quiet in the way that people become quiet after a loss that does not resolve itself. Her husband, Thomas, had worked for the railroad survey crews before the accident that took him. He had been a careful man, a note-keeper, a planner, someone who trusted what he wrote down more than what he remembered. When Veda saw Odell walking north with a mule and a tool bag and a black dog, she recognized something in the girl's posture that she could not have named aloud but understood completely. She went inside and cut a piece of cornbread and filled a canteen with water and went to the road. Odell had stopped at the sound of the gate, one hand on Tess's halter, ready to keep moving. "You look like you know where you're going," Veda said. She held out the bread and the canteen. Odell took them. "I do," she said. Veda nodded. She looked up toward Ironback Ridge, then back at Odell, and something settled in her expression, a decision being made. "The rock at the base of that ridge changes color about 40 feet in from the south face," she said, "where it goes lighter. My husband mapped that area years ago. He wrote that there's a groundwater seam running underneath about 12 feet down. Stays cold all year. He called it the best natural coal cellar in the county if anyone was fool enough to dig for it. A pause. He meant that as a compliment. Then she went back inside. Odell stood for a moment, the canteen in her hand, looking at the closed door. She filed away what she had been told with the same careful attention she applied to everything her father had ever taught her. Then she turned and walked on. The work was a different kind of education than any she had received before. The outer granite resisted for the first 3 days with a stubbornness that was almost personal. The pickaxe rang and bounced, and Odell's palms opened and bled and sealed over with fluid and opened again. On the evening of the third day, she found the sandstone seam, and everything changed. The rock began to yield in a new way, not easily but honestly giving ground when she gave effort, telling her through the tone of each strike where to press and where to rest. She was engineering something, though she would not have used that word. The main chamber needed to be large enough to hold a winter's worth of smoked meat and stored vegetables for one person. That was the minimum. The cold cellar behind it, accessed through a low stone doorway, would sit directly above the groundwater seam that Veda had described, letting the mountain's chill press upward through the floor year-round. And the 2 ventilation shafts she planned to carve, angling upward through 60 feet of rock to emerge hidden among the junipers at the ridge's crown, those would give her what a smokehouse needed most control. By adjusting the heavy stone plugs she would set at each shaft's base, she could regulate the flow of air through the chamber, pulling smoke up and away from the meat on the iron racks, slowing it or quickening it depending on what she was curing. She understood all of this because she had watched her father her entire childhood. She had handed him tools and held the lamp and listened when he explained what he was doing, even when she was young enough that the words meant nothing and the sounds meant everything. He had talked to her the way he talked to himself, which was the only honest way he knew how to talk at all. The detail work on the ventilation shafts took the better part of 3 weeks. The shafts had to be narrow enough to be concealed by the juniper growth at the surface, but wide enough to move air efficiently, and they had to run at an angle that would create a natural draft. Odell made mistakes and corrected them. She chiseled too wide in one section and had to pack the gap with clay. She hauled up from the creek bed in a bucket, smoothing it with her thumb until the surface held. She cut too shallow on the second shaft's lower curve and had to go back at it for 2 full days. Grit watched all of it. He was her early warning system and her timepiece and her only real company. When the sun moved past a certain juniper's shadow, she stopped for water. When Grit's ears went flat, she stopped for any other reason. His judgment was reliable. She slept in the overhang, wrapped in 2 blankets with the dog warm against her side. Graymore decided what to think about Odell Tanner within the first 2 weeks, which was about average for a town of that size. Philo Fenn, who owned the general store and served as the unofficial newspaper editorial board and public conscience of the community, was the one who named it. He called it Tanner's Folly first, then settled on the Tanner Girl's Folly after someone pointed out that she had apparently stopped using the family name. He used the phrase with the careful pity of a man who considers himself a decent person and wants the record to reflect that. "Such a shame," he would say, shaking his head, while his customers nodded. "Her father was a good man. That girl has gone peculiar up there." The laughter that followed was the easiest kind, the kind that costs nothing and means less. Reverend Cornelius arrived at the base of the ridge on a Wednesday morning in Odell's second week of work, picking his way over the uneven ground in his church shoes with the expression of a man performing a charitable errand that he expected to be thanked for. He was a tall man, thin in the way that certain kinds of conviction make people thin, with a careful smile that he kept ready at all times the way other men kept a pocket watch. "Odell," he said. He had to say it twice because she did not stop working on the first call. She lowered the pickaxe and looked at him. "I've come because people are worried about you," he said. "Several families in town have room to spare. You'd have a roof and meals and decent company. You could take in sewing or help with children. It would be appropriate." He paused, modulating his voice towards something he called kindness. "A young woman alone on a cliff face is not what God intends." Odell rested the pickaxe against the rock. "Do you know what God intends, Reverend?" "I know what community intends," he said without missing a beat. In a girl of your age, in your circumstances, my circumstances, Odell said, are my own. Thank you for coming. She picked up the pickaxe and went back to work. Cornelius stood there for a moment, his smile holding steady while his eyes recalibrated. He had expected argument or tears. What he got was dismissal, which was something entirely different and considerably harder to address. He made his way back down the ridge with his shoes gathering dust, and in the weeks that followed, he spoke about Odell from the pulpit and at dinner tables and at the edges of conversations with the gentle, relentless persistence of a man who has been refused and has chosen not to acknowledge it. Troy Slade asked no questions. He was a man of about 50, heavy across the shoulders with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same granite Odell was digging through. He had run the smithy at the south end of town for 20 years. He did not attend Reverend Cornelius's church or any church, and he did not gather on Fielo's porch in the mornings. He was in the way of certain solitary people entirely self-contained. When Odell came into the smithy and asked to trade a month of mending work for 3 iron rods and a set of heavy hooks, Troy looked at her hands before he looked at her face. He turned them over once, examining the new calluses, the split skin that had healed, and split again, the particular roughness that accumulates only through sustained, repeated work. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, I can make you something better than rods. Cross-braced frame, holds more weight, distributes the load. Won't work loose over time the way straight rods will. I can't pay for that much work, Odell said. I know, he said. I didn't say anything about paying. She looked at him. My wife and my boy died the winter of the Great Freeze, he said flatly without self-pity, stating it the way you state a fact that has become simply part of the architecture of your life. Same winter, I think you lost somebody. Odell said nothing, but something shifted in her expression, a slight involuntary softening, the way a face changes when it recognizes itself in another face. Good steel needs a strong fire, Troy said. He turned back to his forge. Come back in 4 days. On her way out of the smithy, Odell passed Pearl Fenn, standing in the doorway of the dry goods store across the street. Pearl was Philo Fenn's wife, a woman of about 40, with good posture and careful eyes, who had spent 20 years being quiet in exactly the right moments. She was not laughing at the jokes her husband told on the porch. She was watching Odell walk past with an expression that was not pity and not admiration, but something that lived between them, the look of a woman doing a private calculation she has not yet finished. Odell noticed. She filed it away the same way she filed away everything that might matter later. Court came to the ridge on a morning in the 4th week, and he did not come alone. He had brought Reverend Cornelius, which Odell recognized immediately as a strategy rather than a coincidence. Court was many things, but he was not subtle, and bringing a man of the cloth to a conversation he expected to be difficult was the act of someone who wanted moral weight on his side before the argument began. Cornelius hung back at a respectful distance, his hands folded, his expression one of grave concern. Court stood at the entrance to the tunnel Odell had been digging and looked into the cool darkness with something moving behind his eyes that he was working hard to control. People are talking, Odell, he said. It reflects on the family. I told you, Odell said. I'm not using the family name. Court's jaw tightened. That doesn't change anything. You are still my father's daughter, and people know it. The bank, he stopped, started again. I am trying to arrange a business loan. The man at the bank asked me about the stability of our household. He used that word, stability. And there it was, not concern for her, concern for his credit line. I see, Odell said. I'm prepared to give you money to go somewhere else. A real town, somewhere you could find proper work. It's a fair offer. He said this with the tone of a man who had rehearsed it and believed the rehearsal made it true. Odell set down her chisel. She looked at her brother for a long moment, and what he saw in her eyes was the thing that unsettled him most. Not anger, not grief, but a kind of settled clarity. A person who has already been through the argument he is trying to start and come out the other side. Court, she said. I registered this land with the county office the day I arrived. It's filed under my name. I own this ground legally. There's nothing here that belongs to you or affects your loan. She picked up the chisel. Now I'm going back to work. Tell Reverend Cornelius I appreciate the visit." Court stood there for a moment. He looked at the tunnel entrance, at the careful stonework she had already framed around the opening, at the chisel marks that covered the inner walls in clean, deliberate lines. He looked at his sister's back, already bent to the stone again, already somewhere else. He left without another word. Cornelius followed him down the slope, and the sound of their footsteps faded into the valley. Veda Marsh was waiting 50 yards down the path, sitting on a flat rock, holding something wrapped in cloth. She had timed her arrival the way of a careful person times the things that matter. She waited until the two men had passed before she walked up to where Odell was working. "I thought you should have this," she said. She unwrapped the cloth and handed over a small leather journal, old and worn, the pages soft with handling. "It was my husband's. He kept survey notes from the whole ridge system." Page 31. Odell opened to it. The handwriting was neat and technical, the handwriting of a man accustomed to precision. The entry on page 31 described a weather pattern documented over multiple decades, a cold air mass that descended from the north at irregular intervals, averaging 15 to 20 years. The last documented occurrence had buried the valley under 6 feet of snow and cut off the main road for 9 weeks. Thomas Marsh had written the date of that event in the margin, underlined twice. Odell did the arithmetic in her head. The last occurrence was 17 years ago. She looked up from the journal and looked down at the valley. She could see the Tanner farm from here, Court's farm now. The neat rows of fence posts, the grain store, the wooden smokehouse that wouldn't survive a hard frost without maintenance. She could see the main road that connected Graymore to the rest of the county, a single thread running through the pass to the north. He also noted, Veda said carefully that the survey office has no record of this land being claimed. "I checked myself last week. The registration window is still open." She placed a second folded paper on top of the journal. Odell looked at it. It was a blank land registration form from the county office. She held both things for a moment, the journal in one hand, the form in the other. Then she said quietly and with complete certainty, "Thank you, Veda." That evening, she walked back down to the county road, into the small office at the far end of town, and filed the registration in the name of Odell Tanner of Ironback Ridge. The clerk stamped it without looking up. She paid the filing fee from the small amount of money she had saved over years of household work, folded her copy of the stamped form, and tucked it beside her father's letter. She walked back up to the ridge in the dark, guided by the familiar path and Grit moving ahead of her. She sat down in the entrance of the tunnel with her back against the cool stone and looked at the sky. The stars were out. The valley below was quiet, its small lights scattered like embers. She could hear nothing from down there, no voices, no laughter at her expense, no careful pity dressed up as concern. Only the wind coming off the ridge and the sound of her own breathing and the dark warm against her leg. She took out her father's letter and the sketch on the back and held them in the lamplight. The blueprint looked back at her, all those careful pencil lines, the life's work of a man who had arrived too late at his own wisdom. She thought about the winter she was 13. She thought about the sound of her mother's cough. She thought about the look on her father's face at the grave, the particular hollow quality of a man who knows the thing he most regrets cannot be undone. She pressed her palm flat against the stone wall beside her. The rock was cold and dry and utterly indifferent, and she loved it for that, for its honesty, for the fact that it would give her exactly what she put into it, and not a thing more. "I'm going to finish it," she said. Not to Grit, not to the valley below, not to anyone who might hear. She said it to the stone. The mountain did not answer. It didn't need to. Autumn was beginning to move through the high country, threading gold through the junipers on the ridge, sharpening the mornings to a cold edge. Tess grazed in her small, sheltered area near the entrance. Grit watched the path below with his amber eyes patient as stone himself. Odell picked up her chisel and went back inside. The racks Troy had built hung empty from the ceiling of the main chamber, cross-braced and solid waiting. The cold cellar breathed its constant chill from the back wall. The ventilation shafts stood open to the sky, drawing a thin, steady current of mountain air through the space. Everything was ready. Now came the harder work. She cured her first batch of venison on a Tuesday 3 weeks into October, and it nearly undid her. Not the work itself. The work was familiar by then. The loading of the fire pit, the adjustment of the stone plugs by feel and instinct, the reading of the smoke, the way her father had read weather by color, by movement, by the way it behaved when it met resistance. All of that came naturally the way things come naturally when they have been paid for in full with months of labor. What undid her was the smell. On the third day when she cut into the first cured haunch to check the color of the meat, the scent that rose from it was so precisely, so mercilessly her mother's kitchen that Odell sat down on the stone floor and did not get up for a long time. Not because she was weak, because some things arrive without warning and demand to be felt before they will let you move past them. The smell of hickory smoke and salt and rendered fat and something deeper underneath the smell of being provided for of a house that was ready of a winter that would not win. Hattie Tanner had made that smell every autumn without fail every year until the year she couldn't. And Prentice had let the habit die with her, too broken to rebuild what her hands had built. And the winters after that had been leaner and colder and quieter until the last winter of all when there was almost nothing left. Odell sat on the stone floor with Grit's head in her lap and let herself understand fully for the first time without flinching what she was doing and why. This was not preparation. This was not survival strategy. This was the answer to a question her father had spent his last years trying to ask. She wiped her face. She stood up. She cut the haunch into portions and hung them on Troy's rack and went back to work. She did not revisit that moment again. She carried it forward instead the way you carry a tool, not thinking about it constantly, but never setting it down. Pearl Fenn came to the ridge on a morning in mid-October, which was unexpected, and she came alone, which was more unexpected still. She arrived at the tunnel entrance with her hands folded in front of her, in a composure so carefully maintained that Odell recognized it immediately as something that had been practiced. Pearl was a woman who had spent a long time being calm in circumstances that did not deserve it. "I'd like to buy something," she said. "If you have anything to sell." Odell looked at her. "Your husband doesn't sell cured meat." "My husband," Pearl said with a precision that contained an entire marriage's worth of information, "sells what he decides to sell to whom he decides to sell it." Odell considered her for a moment, then stepped back from the entrance. Pearl followed her in and stood in the main chamber, while her eyes adjusted and Odell watched her take in the racks, the hanging meat, the organized rows of root vegetables she had been carrying up from town in burlap sacks over the past 3 weeks, the sealed clay crocks of rendered fat lined along the low shelf near the cold cellar door. Pearl said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "How much for 10 pounds of the bacon?" They settled on a trade, a pound of bacon for a pound of flour with a jar of honey added at Pearl's insistence. It was a fair exchange, perhaps slightly in Odell's favor, and both of them knew it. Pearl packed her purchases into the cloth bag she had brought and turned to leave. At the entrance, she paused without turning around. "I saw how much salt you bought last week," she said. "More than anyone in this town buys in a season. I didn't think you were being dramatic." Another pause. "My husband did." She walked back down the ridge path without looking back, her bag held carefully at her side, and Odell stood in the tunnel entrance and watched her go with the quiet attention of someone filing away a piece of information that does not yet have a category but will. The meeting at the church happened on a Thursday evening, and Odell did not know about it until it was over. Reverend Cornelius had called it a community discussion, which was the language he used when he wanted the appearance of democracy without the inconvenience of opposing votes. He had arranged the chairs in a circle rather than rows, a small theatrical choice that suggested equality, while ensuring he remained the person everyone looked at when they needed to understand what was being decided. The subject, as framed by Cornelius, was the welfare of vulnerable community members. In practice, the subject was Odell. He had done his research carefully. There was a provision in county law seldom used designed for genuine cases of mental incapacity by which a family member could petition the circuit court to appoint a guardian for a person deemed unable to manage their own affairs. The standard of proof required was not medical, it was behavioral. Unusual behavior, persistent and documented. A young woman who had abandoned her family home to dig a hole in a cliff face and live in it through the wind, who refused reasonable offers of assistance from her community and her church, who was acquiring livestock and supplies at a rate that suggested either delusion or hoarding, that was Cornelius suggested in his careful way worth discussing. Court Tanner sat in that circle and said nothing. He did not agree aloud. He did not sign anything. He simply sat there with his arms folded and his eyes on the floor, and his presence in that room was the only agreement Cornelius needed, because everyone there understood that a petition of this kind required a family member's signature to proceed, and Court's silence was the sound of a man who had not yet decided not to sign. Troy Slade was not in the habit of attending church meetings. He had come that night for one specific reason, which was that someone whose name he would not give had sent word to the smithy that the meeting was happening and what it was about. He sat in the back of the circle with his coat on and his cap in his hands, and did not speak until Cornelius had finished the preamble and the room had begun the slow settling into agreement that happens when no one is willing to go first against the man who called the meeting. Then Troy said, "I want to ask something before we go further." Cornelius turned towards him with his careful smile. "Of course, Troy. Has anyone here gone up to that ridge and looked at what she's built?" A silence. "I made the ironwork she's using," Troy said. "Cross-braced frame hung from ceiling, anchors I cut myself. The stonework around the entrance is more solid than half the foundations in this town. The ventilation system she carved through 60 feet of granite by hand is more sophisticated than the design on any building I have seen in this county." He paused and let that settle. "Now, the law you're describing, the petition law, it requires evidence of inability to manage one's affairs. What you were describing is a person managing her affairs better than anyone in this room." He put his cap back on. "I'd think carefully before I put my name to the opposite of that." He stood up and walked out. The meeting did not produce a vote. It did not produce a signed petition. What it produced was a particular kind of stillness. The stillness of a room full of people who have been about to do something and have just been made slightly uncertain about it. Court left without speaking to anyone. Cornelius watched him go and understood that the window was closing, though he was not yet ready to admit it. The information about the meeting reached Odell 2 days later through Veda, who had heard it from Pearl Fenn, who had heard it from a woman whose husband had been in the circle. Veda came up to the ridge in the early afternoon and told Odell everything with the spare factual clarity of a person who believes the truth is more useful than comfort. Odell listened without expression. When Veda finished, Odell said, "Did Court sign anything?" "No," Veda said. Odell nodded once. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and took out the folded land registration document, the county seal still clear on the stamped corner, and handed it to Veda without a word. Veda examined it. "You filed this the first evening you arrived," she said. "The same night I came up here," Odell said. Veda handed it back. "Then Cornelius's provision doesn't apply. The petition requires demonstration that the person cannot manage their property. You own this land legally. There's nothing to appoint a guardian over." A pause. "I don't think he knows you filed." Odell put the document back in her pocket. She picked up her shovel. "Let him find out on his own," she said. 3 days later, Cornelius sent a man up the ridge with a formal notice, a written request for what he called a welfare inspection, citing the community provision statute. Odell opened the tunnel door just wide enough to read the paper. She read it, turned it over, and handed it back. "Tell Reverend Cornelius that I hold a registered title to this land from the county recorder's office filing date and still available on request," she said. "If he wants to contest my management of it, the circuit court is open on Mondays." She closed the door. The man went back down the ridge with the paper and whatever dignity he could assemble, and Cornelius read the message with the expression of someone recalculating a bet they thought they had already won. He did not send anyone up the ridge again. It was 11 days after the Cornelius meeting on a cold gray afternoon in late October when the stone came down. Odell had been working on a secondary anchor point in the upper chamber wall, extending the hanging rack system to accommodate a larger load than she had originally planned. She had noticed a section of the wall above the main rack where the granite showed a hairline irregularity, not a crack exactly, more of a seam where two different pressures in the rock had been sitting in uneasy equilibrium for what might have been centuries. She had looked at it 3 times over the past 2 weeks and decided each time that it was stable. On the fourth assessment, she was wrong. The section that came down was roughly the size and weight of a plow blade. It fell without warning. No sound beforehand, no shift or creak, just the sudden terrible reality of several hundred pounds of rock moving through space at speed. It took out 14 feet of her iron rack system, brought down everything hanging in that section, and hit the stone floor with an impact that Odell felt through the soles of her boots all the way to her back teeth. She was not in its path. 3 feet to the left, and the story would have ended there in the dark with no one to know it. She stood very still for a long moment in the settling dust. Grit was pressed against the far wall, unhurt, watching her with his ears flat. The main damage was clear. The rack section was destroyed. The ventilation shaft's lower opening in that section had been partially blocked by fallen debris, and perhaps a third of what she had been curing was on the floor mixed with grit and stone chips. She bent down and picked up a piece of fallen meat. She brushed the stone dust off it, turned it over, set it aside. She did this for the next hour, sorting through the debris, separating what could be salvaged from what could not, stacking the usable pieces in the cold cellar away from the dust. When she finished sorting, she sat on the floor and looked at the damage. The numbers were not good. She had lost close to a third of her cured inventory at a point when she had 3, perhaps 4 weeks left of optimal curing weather before the cold deepened too far. The rack damage meant she could not hang the remainder properly without Troy's ironwork, and the shaft blockage meant her smoke control was compromised until she cleared the debris, which would take 2 days at minimum. Grit came and sat in front of her, watching her face. She did not cry. She did not speak. She sat with the weight of it for exactly as long as it needed to be sat with, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that it was longer than she expected. The image came to her unwanted but clear of the 3 months of work on the floor in pieces of the winter she had been building against, of what it would mean if she was not ready. Then she stood up. She picked up the shovel and began moving stone. 2 days later, Odell walked down from the ridge and went directly to Troy Slade's smithy. She came in through the open door without knocking, which was not something she had done before, and Troy looked up from the anvil and read her face in one glance. She told him what had happened. Not with emotion, just with the facts in order, the section that failed, the dimensions of the damage, what she needed to restore the rack system and clear the shaft properly. Troy set down his hammer. He untied his apron. He picked up his tool bag. Now, Odell said, "Can you think of a better time?" he said. They went up the ridge together, and it was on the path midway between town and the base of the cliff that they encountered Court. He was coming down from a separate direction from the eastern fence line of the Tanner property, and he pulled up short when he saw them. His eyes moved from Odell to Troy, to the tool bag in Troy's hand, to the dried stone dust still visible in Odell's hair. Something crossed his face that was hard to categorize. Not jealousy, not exactly concern. The expression of a man who is watching 2 people solve a problem he has just understood he caused. "Odell," he said. His voice had lost its earlier authority. What was left was something more complicated and considerably less comfortable. "What happened?" "Stonefall," she said. "I'm handling it." He looked at her. He looked at Troy. He looked back at her. "Do you need—" He stopped, started again. "Is there anything I can do?" "No," Odell said. She walked past him. Troy followed without a word. Court stood on the path and watched them go up the slope, and whatever moved through him in that moment was entirely private, but he did not leave. He stood there until they disappeared around the upper curve of the path, and only then turned back toward the valley. The repair took 3 days. Troy rebuilt the rack system stronger than the original, adding a secondary brace along the wall side that distributed the load away from the ceiling anchors. The shaft was cleared and the lower opening reframed with fitted stone. What had been damaged was now better than what had existed before it fell. Odell thanked him at the end of the 3rd day, and Troy shook his head slightly. The way a man shakes his head at a statement he considers beside the point. "Something else," he said before he turned to go. He was looking at the sky northwest with an expression Odell had seen her father use when he was trying to decide whether to say something he had already decided to say. "I don't like the look of the sky the last few mornings. The light quality. My wife used to notice it first before a real storm." He paused. "Not a normal winter storm." Odell looked where he was looking. The sky was clear, but the clarity had a flatness to it, a particular absence of warmth in the light, like a room where someone had recently left. "I noticed it too," she said. Troy walked back down the ridge without another word, and Odell went inside and looked at her inventory and began to recalculate. The morning came 11 days later, when Grit would not lie down. He had been her timepiece and her alarm, and her daily measure of the world's normalcy for every morning of the past 8 months. That morning he was on his feet before first light, pacing the length of the chamber, stopping at the door, pressing his nose to the gap at the bottom, and inhaling, pacing again. His ears moved with a continuous, restless attention, tracking sounds Odell could not hear. She sat up from her blankets and watched him. When he stopped at the door and held still, she put on her coat and went outside. The valley below Ironback Ridge was spread out in the early light, and at first there was nothing obviously wrong. The fields, the fences, the thin line of smoke from the first morning fires in town. Court and Eldon moving in the lower field harvesting the last of the corn. Philo Fenn on his porch at the end of Main Street, a small figure at this distance, sweeping. The noise of the railroad crew faintly audible from the north where they were laying track through the mountain cut 10 miles out. Then she looked north. The sky above the far ridge was not the gray of winter clouds or the blue of clear weather. It was a bruised, dense purple that she had never seen in 10 years of watching weather from this valley. It did not look like sky at all. It looked like something closing. She went inside. She looked at her stored inventory with new eyes. The eyes of someone who was no longer planning for a hard winter, but for something the valley had not seen in 17 years. She had enough for herself easily, probably twice over. For more people, that was a different calculation entirely. She put on her coat again and went down to town for the last time before the cold set in, moving fast, buying the last of the available salt from Philo's store without meeting his eyes, stopping at Veda's door to leave a message that amounted to 2 words written on the back of a receipt, "Get ready." On her way back through the center of town, she passed the church. Cornelius was standing on the front steps with 4 men from the congregation mid-conversation, the mid-morning warmth still comfortable enough that no one had thought to look at what was coming from the north. She slowed, then stopped. Cornelius noticed her and composed his face into welcome. "Odell, what brings you down?" She looked at the men, then back at him. She spoke loudly enough for all of them to hear. "There is a major storm coming from the north. Not ordinary winter weather. It will arrive within 48 hours, and it will last longer than anything most people in this valley have prepared for. If you have any food to store, any stock to bring inside, any additional wood to cut, you should do it today, not tomorrow. Today." The men on the steps were quiet. Cornelius's careful smile did not change. "Thank you, Odell," he said with the particular gentleness he used when he wanted to make something sound like he was managing it. "We'll pray for fair weather." A few of the men smiled. Nothing cruel in it, just the easy amusement of people who believe that the future they know is the only future available. Odell turned and walked back up the road without responding. Inside the dry goods store, framed by the window, Pearl Fenn watched Odell's retreating figure. She turned and looked north out the opposite window. She stood there for a full minute looking at that purple bruise on the horizon. Then she went into the back room without a word to her husband and began moving sacks of flour and beans to the highest shelf. The storm arrived not in 48 hours, but in 36, as if it had decided not to wait. It began with a sound rather than a sight, a low, sustained pressure in the air, the kind that makes dogs stop what they are doing and stand still. Grit was at the door before Odell heard it. She barred the door, lit the oil lamp, and pulled Tess deeper into the alcove, checking the water barrels, running through the list in her mind. The first hour was quiet, just the wind building a low note that rose steadily through registers she had not heard before, not the howl of ordinary winter gales, but something older and deeper, a sound from much further north than any wind that belonged to this valley. Then the temperature dropped. Not gradually, it dropped the way a trapdoor opens in a single irreversible instant. The snow came sideways when it came visible through the ventilation shaft openings as a white horizontal blur driven by wind that made the mountain itself seem to lean. Odell closed the stone plug, sealing the shafts, and the chamber fell into a deep, still warmth that felt almost unreal after the growing violence outside. The fire pit held. The lamp held. Grit settled at her feet. She sat and listened to the storm's assault on the ridge above her, and thought about the 5,000 men in canvas tents 10 miles up the valley, and the 200 people in houses that had never been tested by anything like what was pressing against the rock above her head. And she thought about her brothers in the farmhouse, and she thought about the wooden smokehouse on the Tanner property that she had noticed last spring was missing 3 boards on its windward wall. There was enough food in this mountain to feed a small army. She had built it that way, not quite knowing why, following the blueprint her father had sketched in the faith that the reason would eventually become clear. She was beginning to understand the reason now. The wind outside rose to a pitch that was no longer wind, but something else entirely. The sound of the world coming apart at its edges. The sound of every plan and assumption that had not been dug into bedrock being stripped away. She could hear it finding every gap and weakness in the valley below, could almost feel the confidence of 100 different people meeting something it had never expected to meet. Odell put another piece of wood on the fire. She scratched behind Grit's ears. She was not frightened. She had been frightened once, standing on the stone floor, with the dust still settling from the fallen section of wall, looking at a third of her work lying in pieces around her feet. She had sat with that fear until she understood it, and then she had picked up the shovel. Fear was useful when you let it teach you, and wasteful when you let it stop you. She had learned that in a hard enough school that the lesson had become structural, built into her the same way the ventilation shafts were built into the ridge, fixed in load-bearing and not going anywhere. Outside, the storm deepened. She could not have known, sitting in the warmth of the chamber she had built by hand over 8 months of solitary labor, exactly what was happening in the valley below. She could not have known that the roof of the Tanner barn was already failing under the weight of a snow accumulation that should have taken a week to arrive, but had come down in 8 hours. She could not have known that the road through the mountain pass was gone, not blocked, but simply gone buried under a slide of wind-packed snow 20 feet deep that would not shift for weeks. She could not have known that in a camp of 5,000 men 10 miles north, a foreman named Jarvis was standing in the wreckage of his supply tent, watching the only map of the access roads disappear under white and understanding for the first time that he was not managing a weather event, but surviving one. She knew only what the stone around her told her. It was cold outside, and it would be cold for a long time, and the mountain was keeping its own temperature steady, regardless, the same way it had been doing since before anyone in that valley had a name. 3 days passed, then 5, then 10. On the 12th day, Grit's head came up from her lap. He was not alarmed. He was attending. His ears moved forward, and he looked toward the door with the expression he reserved for things that were familiar, known quantities approaching from a known direction. Odell sat up. Someone was outside. More than one person. She could hear them now, the muffled sounds of movement in heavy snow, the irregular rhythm of exhausted people trying to locate something they were not certain existed. Then a voice cracked with cold, and something close to despair came through the door. "Is anyone in there? We've come from town." Odell stood up. Grit was at the door tail, moving once, twice. She put her hand on the bar. She had built this place as a promise to a woman who had died of cold and hunger in an early spring that came too late. She had built it against every person who had called her a fool and a burden and an embarrassment. She had built it with her own hands and her own stone on her own registered ground, with no help from anyone except a taciturn blacksmith who had never asked to be thanked, a widow who had given her a dead man's notebook, and a dog who had followed her without being asked. She lifted the bar. She pulled the door open. The cold came in like a wall, and with it came the ragged, frost-covered faces of a dozen men, and behind them a world of white, so absolute and so complete that the valley she had spent her whole life looking down at had simply ceased to exist. At the front of the group stood Court Tanner, his hands bare and bleeding, his proud jaw set with something that was no longer pride, but its opposite and its equal, the complete unguarded surrender of a man who has been wrong about the only thing that mattered. Beside him, Eldon, his eyes already full. Odell looked at them all. She looked at her brother's ruined hands. She looked past him at the white erasure of everything she had grown up in. She pulled the door wide open and stepped back to let them in. They came in out of the white like men returning from somewhere no map had ever named. Court entered first, which was not leadership, but instinct. The oldest habit of the oldest son, to be first through any door, even one he had no right to. Behind him came Eldon, then Troy, then the 8 other men from town, and last of all a man. Odell did not recognize one of the railroad workers who had made it to Graymoor before the road disappeared. 12 men in total, and every one of them carried the same thing on his face, the specific blankness of a person whose body has been running on nothing but necessity for so long that the mind has gone quiet to conserve what remains. Odell stepped back from the entrance and let them through. The effect of the chamber on men who had been living in frozen houses with emptying larders for nearly 2 weeks was not dramatic. It was quieter than that and more complete. They stopped moving. One by one, they simply stopped in the way that exhausted animals stop when they finally reach shelter. Not with relief exactly, but with the cessation of the relentless forward effort that had been holding them upright. The warmth reached them first, then the smell, and then their eyes began to work again, adjusting to the lamplight, taking in the racks of cured meat, the stacked root vegetables, the sealed crocks, the organized abundance of a space that had been built with exactly this moment in mind, though Odell had never articulated it quite that way even to herself. One of the men from town, a rancher named Pollard, who had laughed at Philo's jokes on the porch more than once, sat down on the stone floor with his back against the wall and put his face in his hands. Not weeping, just stopping. Troy looked at the repaired rack system at the new wall brace he had installed 3 weeks earlier and said nothing, but he looked at it for a long time. Eldon sat down near the fire pit, and his shoulders dropped in a way that suggested something leaving his body that had been lodged there for days. He was not a man given to visible emotion, had never been, and the smallness of that gesture, just his shoulders falling, just the release of held tension, was the most honest thing Odell had seen from him in years. Court stood in the center of the chamber and turned slowly, taking in all of it. He turned the full 360 degrees the way a man turns when he is trying to understand the true dimensions of a space. When he completed the turn and faced Odell again, he looked older than he had at the land reading 8 months ago, and the authority that had always organized his features had been replaced by something that had no name in his vocabulary, but that Odell recognized immediately as the beginning of genuine understanding. "Odell," he said. The voice was stripped of everything it had once carried. "I don't know what to say to you." "Then don't say anything yet," Odell said. "Sit down." She moved to the supplies section and began pulling portions from the hanging racks from the bins, working with the quick efficiency of someone who has been mentally planning this distribution for days. She handed Troy a wrapped portion without looking at him. He took it without comment. She worked through this group in silence, giving each man what she could spare, immediately enough to eat, enough to carry back. When she reached Court, she paused for a moment. He was watching her hands, the same hands he had dismissed at the land reading, the same hands that had built everything around them. She gave him his portion and moved on. It was Court who finally broke the quiet that had settled over the group. He spoke to the room rather than to Odell, which was perhaps the only way he could say it. "She built this alone," he said. "I gave her a mule and a box of old tools, and I told her the farm was men's work." He let that sit for a moment. "I was wrong about that. I was wrong about what the work was." No one responded. No one needed to. Odell looked up from her inventory. "How many people are in town right now?" The railroad worker answered first, his voice rough from days of cold. "When we left this morning, there were about 200, maybe a few more, some families from the outlying farms who came in when the snow started. And the railroad camp," the man's expression changed in a way that said more than his words. "Last I knew, 5,000 men. Jarvis has been keeping order, but the rations ran out 4 days ago. He sent 3 scout teams out. None came back. A pause. The camp is 10 miles north and the road is buried. Getting there is not a small thing. Odell nodded one. She went back to her calculation. She moved through numbers the way her father had moved through the fields, methodically without waste, finishing one row before starting the next. What she had, what the town needed, what the camp needed, what she could distribute immediately, what required transport planning, what could be rationed across days versus what needed to go first. She had been running these numbers in her head for 3 days since the storm's first night, and they had the solidity of things that have been checked and rechecked until you trust them. "We'll load what you can carry on the first trip," she said. "Hams, bacon, potatoes, as much as each man can manage. When you get back to town, children and elderly eat first, not discussion. That's the order." Court looked at her. "You've been planning this already." "Since the second night of the storm," she said. He did not say anything to that, but something moved through his expression that Odell had never seen there before. Not admiration exactly, though that was part of it. It was the look of a man confronting the distance between what he had assumed and what was true, and finding that distance much larger than he had known. They loaded in near silence, working with the focused economy of people who understand that speed matters. Troy organized the packing with the same systematic attention he brought to the smithy, making sure the weight was distributed evenly, that nothing fragile was placed where it would be crushed, that the most calorie-dense items went to the strongest carriers. The railroad worker helped without being asked, which told Odell something about him. When the first group was ready to move, Court stayed behind. Eldon looked at him, but Court shook his head slightly. Eldon led the others out, and the sound of their movement through the snow faded with the closing of the door, and the chamber was quiet again. Court sat on the low stone bench near the fire pit with his hands on his knees. They were in bad shape, split across the knuckles, 2 nails blackened from the digging, the skin raw in a way that would take weeks to heal. Odell noticed without commenting on it. She continued her inventory. "The barn roof came down on the 3rd day," Court said. "Most of the cattle. The grain store is buried, the wooden smokehouse." He stopped. Odell knew about the missing board she had noticed in the spring. She said nothing. "I kept thinking about what you said, about why you were doing this. I thought you were punishing us for the inheritance." Odell looked up from the shelf. "No," she said. "I was never doing this to make a point." "I know that now," he said. "I knew it somewhere around day 4 when I was feeding the last of the flour to the children on our road." A pause. "I spent a lot of time being wrong about you." "You spent a lot of time being certain," Odell said. "Those aren't always the same thing, but they often feel like it." Court looked at the floor. Then he said quietly, "I'm sorry, Odell, for the land reading. For what I said then. For what I said every time after that." Odell set down what she was holding. She looked at her brother, at the ruin the winter had made of his confidence, at the real person that ruin had uncovered. She had carried anger at him for 8 months. She had used it as fuel, had let it drive the pickaxe on the worst mornings, had taken some satisfaction she could admit now in imagining this exact moment, the grand reckoning, the apology she was owed. But sitting with it in reality, it was quieter than she had imagined. And the anger she found when she looked for it was not the fire she remembered. It was more like ash, the evidence of a fire that had already served its purpose and gone out. "Hunger doesn't care about apologies," she said. "It only cares about being fed. That's what we're doing now." She picked up what she had set down. "When this is over, we'll talk. But right now, I need you to go back to town and make sure Philo doesn't take control of the distribution." Court looked up sharply. "Philo, he'll want to manage it," Odell said. "He'll have reasons that sound reasonable. Don't let him." Court stood up. The remnant of his old authority was still there. She could see not the false kind built on assumption, but something underneath it that had always been real. The capacity to lead when leading was actually required. "Understood," he said. He went to the door. With his hand on the bar, he stopped without turning. "Father would have—" He didn't finish the sentence. "I know," Odell said. He went out into the white. The delivery to Graymore happened in 3 stages over the course of that first day, With the men making the round trip twice more after the initial run, their endurance rebuilt by food and purpose. By early evening, every household in the valley had received provisions. Odell had calculated the distribution so that no family received more than they needed for 4 days, which kept the overall supply sustainable and gave her the flexibility to plan the harder operation in the railroad camp. When the first loaded sleds reached Main Street, Philo Fenn was already on his porch. He had seen the procession coming and had descended to the street with the air of a man resuming a position he had briefly vacated, the central authority, the man through whom things were properly organized. He was carrying his ledger book, which was either preparedness or theater, possibly both. "I'll take charge of the distribution from here," he said, stepping into the path of the lead sled. "We'll use the store as a central point, more orderly that way." Court, leading the sled, stopped walking. The men behind him stopped. There was a moment of complete stillness, the kind that happens when a situation is waiting to find out what kind of moment it is. "Step aside, Philo," Court said. Philo blinked. In 20 years of community life, Court Tanner had never spoken to him that way. "Now, Court, I understand you're tired, but there are practical considerations. Step aside." The same words, the same tone, no escalation required because the first delivery had already been sufficient. Philo looked at the other men. He looked at the sleds. He looked at Court's hands, still bandaged with strips torn from a shirt, at the 12 hours of fought snow that had put those men where they were. Whatever calculation Philo Fenn was running in his mind, it arrived at its conclusion. He stepped back. Pearl Fenn appeared in the doorway of the store behind him. She had been watching through the window. She came down to the street and walked straight to the first sled and began organizing the distribution herself, portioning, directing, sending families away with what they needed with a calm competence that suggested she had been waiting for a task this specific for longer than that afternoon. Her husband watched from the porch. After a time, he went inside. By the time darkness came, the smell of cooking had replaced the smell of fear in the houses along Main Street. Odell heard about it later from Veda, who had been in the street when the distribution happened, who described the sound of the town changing, the specific particular quality of relief that arrives not as noise, but as its opposite, as a collective exhale, so deep it felt like a change in the weather. The operation to reach Jarvis's camp took 2 full days to plan and 1 brutal day to execute. Odell organized it the way she organized everything, by starting with what was true and working forward from there. What was true: 10 miles of buried road temperatures that had not risen above single digits in a week, 5,000 men who were past the point of waiting for conditions to improve. What was also true: she had enough smoked and cured meat, enough dried vegetables, enough rendered fat in sealed crocks to sustain that many people for 2 weeks if distributed efficiently. What that required transport capacity she did not have alone. She got it from Jarvis's own men. 2 of the railroad workers who had made it to Graymore before the road closed had experience with winter supply operations from earlier work in the Northern Territories. They knew how to build travel sleds from raw materials, how to pack loads for maximum weight-to-volume efficiency in cold weather, how to navigate by ridgeline when roads were gone. Odell worked with them through an entire evening, planning the route, calculating loads, organizing the supplies into parcels that could be distributed quickly at the far end without requiring sorting. Troy contributed 3 large transport frames he built overnight, working by lantern until nearly dawn. Court organized the carrying party, 14 men, the strongest available people, who had recovered enough from their own ordeal to take on another one. Odell led them out at first light. The 10 miles took 9 hours. The buried road was navigable in theory, but punishing in practice, the snow in some sections, chest deep, requiring the carriers to break trail in rotation, so no one man bore the full exhaustion of going first for long. Grit moved ahead of the group, reading the surface, finding the compressed sections where the road underneath gave the snow a different quality underfoot. The men learned to watch him. When the camp came into view, it was not what Odell had expected, and she had expected something bad. The tents that remained standing were crusted with ice on their windward sides, the fabric so stiff it no longer moved in the wind. The majority of the camp's fires had gone out, the fuel exhausted, and the men who were ambulatory were gathered around the 3 or 4 that remained pressed so close that the inner ring could not have moved if they had wanted to. The ones who were not ambulatory were inside the tents, and that was a category whose full meaning Odell did not examine closely, because examining it closely would not help anyone. Jarvis met her at the camp's edge. He was a big man, the kind whose physical scale usually announces itself from a distance. But the winter had worked on him the same way it worked on everything, reducing, stripping away what was supplementary and leaving only the structural. He looked at the line of carriers behind Odell and at the loaded sleds, and his expression went through several things rapidly before settling on something that was not quite disbelief and not quite relief, but the precarious space between them, where a man stands when he is afraid to commit to either. "Who are you?" he said. "My name is Odell Tanner," she said. "We brought you 2 weeks of provisions." Jarvis looked past her at the sleds. He was doing the same mental arithmetic she had done, and arriving at the same conclusion. She had arrived at the scale of what was being delivered, meant that it had been accumulated over months deliberately in quantities that far exceeded any individual's personal need. He looked back at her face, at the 18-year-old face, the direct eyes, the absolute absence of drama in her bearing, and she watched him recalibrate his understanding of something. "You knew this was coming," he said. "I knew it could come," she said. "That's a different thing. Can you organize your men for distribution? I'd suggest starting with whoever is in the worst condition." Jarvis turned and called for his section leaders, and the organized chaos of a large-scale emergency distribution began, and Odell moved through it the way she moved through all her work, methodically, without waste-solving each problem as it presented itself and moving to the next. It took 4 hours to distribute the full load. In that 4 hours, Odell watched 5,000 men go from the particular stillness of the near broken to something that was not yet strength, but was its prerequisite, the knowledge that the body would continue, that tomorrow existed, that the future had not in fact closed off at the edges of the visible white. Near the end, one of the older workers, a man who would have been in his late 50s with the particular build of someone who had spent decades doing the kind of physical labor that reshapes the skeleton, stopped beside her while she was counting the remaining stock. "I've worked railroad camps from here to the Canadian border," he said. "I've seen companies spend $100,000 on winter operations and get it wrong." He paused. "You did this alone." "I had help," Odell said. "A blacksmith, a widow, a dog." The man looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked away, and Odell returned to her count. The storm broke on the 43rd day. Not suddenly. It unraveled the way those storms always unravel in the end, the wind dropping first, then the quality of the silence changing. Then a thin line of light appearing at the northern horizon that was different from the reflected white of the snow. Actual light, directional and warm. By afternoon, the sky had opened to a blue so clear it looked new, as if the color had been invented that morning specifically for this occasion. The valley that emerged from beneath the snow was altered. It would have been unrecognizable to someone who had not known it before, but to the people who lived there, every change was legible. The collapsed barn here, the fence line there, the trees bent permanently by the wind's long argument, the creek bank eaten away the road into the past, still sealed and likely to stay that way for weeks more. The Tanner farm had taken damage that would require a full season to repair. The barn was gone. The wooden structures were gone. What remained was the stone foundation of the main house. The house itself and the land, 160 acres of good valley soil, now resting under 2 feet of snow that would become 2 feet of moisture when it released the best possible start for a spring planting. Odell came down from the ridge on the morning after the break, the first time she had been in town in 6 weeks. Grit walked at her side. She did not announce herself. She had provisions to trade, and she went to the people she knew needed them most, working her way through the streets with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. She was at the corner of Mill and 2nd Street when Reverend Cornelius found her. He looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with the winter's physical toll. He was well fed enough the distribution had reached him equally with everyone else on Odell's explicit instruction, because her instruction had been that everyone ate regardless of history. But there was something hollowed in his bearing that had not been there before, a quality of reckoning that did not sit easily on a man accustomed to being the one who framed other people's accounts. Odell, he said. She waited. He had clearly prepared something to say and found in the moment of saying it that it was inadequate. He started twice. Then he said simply, I was wrong about you. I don't expect that to mean much. Odell looked at him with an evenness that was not coldness and not forgiveness, but something more useful than either, the willingness to proceed without requiring anything further. It means what it means, she said. Are the families on your street all right? He blinked. Yes, yes, everyone on the street is well. Thanks to, he stopped again. Thanks to you. Good, Odell said and moved on. She heard later from Veda that Cornelius had spoken from his pulpit the following Sunday in terms that were as close as he was constitutionally capable of getting to a direct acknowledgement. Veda reported it without judgment, as she reported everything, and Odell received it the same way. She had not built the vault to change Cornelius. She had built it to survive the winter, and the winter was over, and that was enough. Court and Eldon came together, which told Odell something had been agreed to between them in advance. They came on a clear afternoon, about a week after the break, picking their way up the ridge path with the awkward care of men entering a space they know they forfeited their easy claim to. Court was carrying a folded paper, and Eldon was carrying nothing, which was the most honest way to arrive. They sat in the entrance of the chamber in the thin spring light that was beginning to find its angle through the valley, and Court unfolded the paper and laid it on the stone between them. It was the deed to the Tanner farm, all of it, the land, the water rights, the structures that remained the soil her father had worked for 30 years. Transferred to Odell Tanner by mutual agreement of Court and Eldon Tanner. It's yours, Court said. You've earned it more honestly than we ever held it. Odell looked at the deed. She looked out at the valley, at the Tanner land visible from the ridge, the fields beginning to show their first dark patches as the snow retreated. She thought about what her father had built there and what he had not built, and the letter he had left her and what she had done with it. She did not pick up the deed. The farm is your work, she said, not with bitterness, with the same settled clarity she had carried since the morning she walked away from it. You know how to work that land. It needs people who will work it. She folded the deed and handed it back. What it needs from me is what I've already given it a reason to last through the winter. Court held the return deed and looked at it and looked at her. There was grief in his face, genuinely the grief of a man who has spent 8 months understanding his own failure and finds that the correction he hoped to make cannot be made in the form he had planned. But there was also something that was not grief, a recognition, perhaps, that the correction had already been made, just not in the form he had imagined. What do you want then, he said. It was the first time he had ever asked her that. Odell thought about it for a moment, which was itself knew the luxury of being asked. I want to teach this valley how to not need saving again, she said. I want every family on every farm between here and the pass to know how to build a cold cellar and cure their own meat and read the sky in October. I want what happened this winter to be the last time it can happen. She paused. Help me with that, and we're even. Eldon, who had not spoken in the entire conversation, looked up. He said, tell us what to do. Jarvis's people came in a delegation 3 weeks after the thaw began. There were 4 of them, including Jarvis himself, riding horses that had been borrowed from the first supply train to get through the reopened pass. They came up the ridge with the formal bearing of men on official business, which was slightly undercut by the fact that Jarvis kept looking around at the cliff face and the stonework at the entrance with an expression that was clearly not what he had prepared. They made their offer inside in the warmth of the chamber that had fed their 5,000 men, seated on the low stone bench with cups of tea that Odell had heated on the fire pit. The railroad company was prepared to pay a substantial sum. Jarvis named the figure. It was enough to buy a house anywhere in the county, to live without working for several years, to be comfortable by any ordinary standard. Odell listened to all of it. Then she said, I don't want money. Jarvis looked at her. He had known this was possible. Name your price then. Salt, she said. A year's supply delivered to the base of the ridge before winter. Iron tools, I'll give you the specifications. And a cartload of saplings to replace the trees the storm took. She paused, and I want the story told. Jarvis's eyebrows moved. The story. What one person with enough time and enough purpose can build. Tell it to the men on your crews. Tell it in the towns along the line. Not because it's about me, because it's about what preparation is worth. What it costs and what it saves. She met his eyes directly. 5,000 men almost died because no one expected the worst to happen. The worst happens. Someone should say so. Jarvis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You knew this was coming, and you told people. On the street before the storm. Cornelius thanked you and dismissed you." "Yes," Adele said. "And you still gave his congregation food." "Yes." Jarvis looked at the chamber around him, at the organized, functional, deeply considered architecture of a life built to last. "I'll tell the story," he said. "I'll make sure it's told correctly." He did. The story traveled the railroad line from the mountain pass to the eastern terminus, told in camps and depots. In the small towns that the rail touched, the story of the girl who dug into a cliff face and fed 5,000 men. It was not always told accurately. Details shifted with the telling, as details do. But the core of it held, which is what cores are for. The valley became something different in the seasons that followed. Not different in its geography or its essential character, but different in the way a community becomes different when it has looked at its own vulnerability squarely and decided to do something about it. Odell taught, and the people of Graymore learned, and the learning spread outward from there, the way the smell of wood smoke spreads from a fire that has found its draft. Pearl Fenn became her most capable student and her most effective teacher. She learned cold cellar construction, food preservation, and the reading of autumn weather signs with the focused intensity of a woman who had found late in life the work she should have been doing all along. She taught other women who taught their husbands, who taught their neighbors. Philo Fenn, watching his wife become the most respected person in Graymore, by doing the thing he had mocked, underwent the kind of slow private reckoning that does not produce dramatic moments, but produces changed behavior, which is more durable and more valuable. Court and Eldon rebuilt the Tanner farm, not the way it had been before, but better, a stone barn this time, a proper root cellar, a smokehouse with the flue that Odell had approved. They worked alongside their neighbors, and they shared what they learned as they learned it, and the farm became something their father had never quite managed to make it, a place that was part of the community it sat in rather than separate from it. Veda Marsh came up to the ridge at least once a week through the spring and summer. They did not speak much. They worked together, or they sat together in comfortable silence. Veda brought things occasionally: a piece of cloth, a jar of preserves, a cutting from a plant she thought might grow well in the ridge soil. Odell received them the way she received everything useful, without ceremony, with genuine gratitude, with immediate thought for where the thing fit in the larger order of the work. Troy added to the chamber over time as new needs became clear to him. A better drainage channel beneath the cold cellar floor. A reinforced door frame that would take the weight of a heavy snow accumulation without warping. A small forge space in the secondary alcove that let Odell do minor metalwork without making the trip to town. He never asked permission. He would arrive on a given morning with materials and a purpose, do the work with complete concentration, and leave. Odell understood this as the way certain people show care, through improvement rather than declaration. The name Aaron Back Vault held. People used it the way people use names that have earned themselves without thinking about it, because it had become the only word for the thing. It was a year to the week after the storm broke when the girl came. She was 12 years old, dark-haired, with the particular watchfulness of children who have grown up around large events. Her father was one of the railroad workers who had decided to stay in Graymore after the thaw, a quiet man skilled with his hands, who had found in the valley a life he preferred to the life on the line. She climbed the ridge path on a clear October afternoon without telling anyone where she was going, and arrived at the vault entrance to find Odell outside checking the junipers that had grown around the ventilation shaft openings. Grit was there, older now, moving more slowly but still at his post. The girl looked at the cliff face, at the careful stonework at the dark entrance, and the faint smell of wood smoke and cured meat that came from it. She looked at Odell, who was watching her with calm attention. "Is it true you built this by yourself?" she said. "Most of it," Odell said. The girl looked at the cliff face again. "How long did it take?" "The better part of a year. And then the storm came and you saved everybody." Odell considered the framing. "The storm came," she said, "and I had what people needed. That's a different thing." The girl looked at her directly with the unguarded curiosity that belongs to the young. "Weren't you scared up here by yourself?" Odell finished checking the last juniper and straightened up. She looked at the valley below, at the farm fields beginning their autumn colors, at the thin smoke from the chimneys of Graymore, at the pass to the north where the sky was clear and deep and cold in the particular way of October. She thought about this morning she had walked away from the farmhouse with a mule and a worn tool bag and a dough and a letter from her father in her pocket. She thought about the first strike of the pickaxe against the granite, the ring of it coming back at her from the stone, the mountain's flat refusal to pretend anything. She thought about the months of solitary work, the stonefall, the nights when the wind came off the ridge with a voice that had nothing kind in it. She thought about opening a door in a blizzard and finding her brother's ruined hands on the other side. "I was afraid of one thing," she said. "Well, the mountain, not the cold, not being alone." She looked at the girl. "I was afraid of being caught empty-handed when it mattered. Of being like the neighbor who had nothing to give." She paused. "That's the only fear worth carrying. The rest of them will take care of themselves if you do the work." The girl thought about this with the seriousness that some children bring to things that are meant for adults. "How do you know when you've done enough work?" she said. Odell looked at the vault entrance, at the smoke rising from the ventilation shaft in its thin, steady thread, at the year's provisions waiting inside in the cool and the dark. "You don't stop to ask that question," she said. "You ask instead, what does next winter look like? And you get back to work." She went inside. Grit followed his nails quiet on the stone floor. The door remained open behind them, the way she had taken to leaving it in daylight, because a closed door was for storms, and this was not a storm. This was October. This was the time for filling what was empty, sealing what needed sealing, reading the sky, and trusting the preparation you had made and making it better. Old Chet opened his eyes on his porch in Missouri and looked at his grandson, who had been listening without moving. "That's the story," Chet said. The boy was quiet for a moment. "What happened to her?" "After everything." Chet rocked for a moment, thinking about how to say it accurately. "She stayed on that ridge her whole life," he said. "People came to her from all over the county to learn what she knew. She never made it complicated. She just kept showing people how to be ready." He paused. "I went back there about 10 years after that winter. I wanted to see the place again, see if it was what I remembered." He was quiet for a moment. "It was bigger. She'd expanded the main chamber, added more cold storage, put in better drainage. Troy Slade had built her a little forge. There were saplings around the entrance that had grown into real trees." "Was she the same?" the boy asked. Chet considered this seriously. "She was more herself," he said finally. "That's the only way I can say it. She was more of what she always was." He looked out at the tree line. "She asked me how I was doing. She made me a cup of tea. She sent me back down the ridge with a side of cured pork and told me to give it to whoever needed it most when I got home." The boy looked at his grandfather. "Did you?" Chet smiled for the first time in the telling. "I gave it to the family 3 houses down," he said. "They'd had a bad fall, needed it more than me." He settled back in his chair. "Which is the point, son. That's always the point. You build what you can. You give what you have. And you get back to work before the next winter finds you empty-handed." The porch was quiet. The afternoon light was long and golden across the yard, the particular light of a day moving toward its end with nothing left unfinished.